So, hello everyone. My name is Meghan Felt, and I'm a Canadian immigration lawyer based out of Canada. Today, I will be speaking about the Atlantic Immigration Pilot Program and giving you some information on how it works, the timeline, the criteria, and also some tips for filing this type of application. So this type of application, the Atlantic Immigration Pilot Program, is a relatively new program in Canada. It was introduced a couple of years ago, and it's a very well approved or a good program, and it's well used in Atlantic Canada. It's obviously only available in Atlantic Canada, so only people who have a job offer in Atlantic Canada qualify. This is the general program requirements are that you have a job offer from an Atlantic Canadian employer. It also requires that you have completed an English test, either the CELPIP or the IELTS. The CELPIP is a Canadian-only test. The IELTS is international, so you can write it anywhere in the world. The requirement for the IELTS is that you have at least a CLB-4. This means a Canadian language benchmark of 4 in every different discipline. So at least a CLB-4 in every different discipline, so a CLB-4 or above. In terms of the program procedure, the first job obviously is to have a Canadian job offer from an Atlantic Canadian employer. This employer, the first step is for this employer to be designated or to get designated. In order to be eligible, this employer has to have been operational in Atlantic Canada for at least 2 years. They apply, and this is something that I often will help employers with, but we apply for designation under this program to the responsible or the particular province, the Canadian Immigration Office of Immigration, for the particular province in which that employer is located. The processing time to get designated is anywhere from a couple of weeks to a month or so. It's dependent on province. And once the designation, once designated, then the next step is for the employee, so the individual, such as yourself, to be designated, to get designated. As part of the designation process, typically the employer has to demonstrate that they tried to hire Canadians first by demonstrating with copies of job ad postings. This is not a requirement if you are already in Canada working on a valid work permit. The designation or the endorsement process, this is step number 2 in the process, typically takes anywhere from 1 month to 3 months for an approval. Once you receive an approval, then the next step is twofold. So you apply for your the federal portion of your permanent residency application, which takes approximately 6 months. This can be filed either outside Canada if you're outside Canada, or it can be filed inland if you're inland. And at the same time, we also apply, if you wish, we can also apply for a work permit for you to either allow you to continue to work in Canada if your work permit is expiring soon, or if you're outside of Canada at the time of application, then we can file the work permit application from outside of Canada. The processing time for the permanent residency piece takes approximately 6 months, and the processing time for the work permit piece will really be dependent on the country in which you are residing. The processing time can be anywhere from a couple of weeks to several months, and it will really depend on the country. Typically, if you are in either the US, typically the processing time for a work permit is approximately 2 weeks. If you are in China, the processing time is approximately 2 or 3 months. These processing times are subject to change at any time. In terms of criteria, I want to discuss the different programs underneath the Atlantic Immigration Pilot Program. There are actually 3 different streams or programs within the EIPP. So the 3 programs are the International Graduate Program, the Intermediate Skilled Program, and also the High Skilled Program. I'll talk about the International Graduate Stream Program first. So the criteria for the International Graduate Stream is that you be currently living and working in Canada on a postgraduate work permit. You obviously have to have a job offer from a Canadian Atlantic immigration employer. Your studies must have been completed in Atlantic Canada. So at least, and you must have lived in Canada for at least 16 months in the 2 years preceding the date of application. You also have to have your CLB4 as discussed earlier. And there's no requirement that you have any work experience. So immediately upon graduation, if you have a job offer and it's a full-time indefinite job offer, then you are eligible for this program. The Atlantic Immigration Intermediate Program is a little bit different. So this program again requires a CLB4. It requires that you have at least 1 year of work experience, 1 year of work experience in a minimum of a NOC position. If you are unfamiliar with NOC codes, NOC codes, these stand for National Occupation Classification Codes. These NOC codes, National Occupation Classification Codes, can be found on the Canadian government website. Essentially, every different occupation in Canada, the Canadian government have assigned a NOC code to it. The NOC codes are, you can either have your NOC code for your particular occupation can either be classified as high skilled, which is NOC A, O, or B, or it can be classified as intermediate skilled, which is NOC C, or it can be classified as low skilled, which is NOC D. NOC D is not eligible for the Atlantic Immigration Pilot Program, not under any of the streams, including the international graduate stream. You must have at least a NOC A, O, B, or C in order to be eligible under the AIPP. Under the intermediate stream, the intermediate skills stream, you must have at least 1 year work experience in a NOC C position, and you also must be offered a job in at least a NOC C position. You must have the CLB4, and you must be offered a job offer from a Canadian employer in Atlantic Canada. In terms of a funds requirement, there may or may not be a funds requirement. The requirement for funds will depend on whether you're currently living and working in Canada. If you're currently living and working in Canada, you do not need to demonstrate proof of funds. If you are not currently living and working in Canada, you must meet the threshold for the Atlantic Immigration Pilot Program, the financial threshold. This financial threshold will be dependent on your family unit size. So the financial threshold will increase per family unit size. So generally speaking, the requirements for the funds requirements for the Atlantic Immigration Pilot Program are lower than other Canadian immigration programs in the country. So we can discuss the funds requirements in a little bit if you want, and I can actually pull up a table and tell you exactly what the requirements are. But of course, if you're already living and working in Atlantic Canada, you do not need to provide funds or proof of funds. The Atlantic Immigration Pilot Program also requires that you have an indefinite job offer, so a permanent full-time job offer. The Atlantic Immigration High Skill Program is very, very similar to the Atlantic Immigration Intermediate Program, except it's for people who have work experience and are being offered a job in a NOC A, O, or B, so a high skill position. The requirements for funds is dependent on family unit size and dependent on whether you are currently living and working in Canada. There is no requirement for you to provide proof of funds if you are, as I mentioned, currently living and working in Canada. The job offer itself must, of course, it must be, again, for a full-time position. And under the high school program, they require that the job be for a duration of at least 1 year from the date that you obtain, from the date that you obtain your permanent residency. So this job offer does not need to be indefinite. It can be for a limited duration, but it must be for at least 1 year from the date that you become a permanent resident. So it is a long-term job offer. The proof of funds. For a family, for one individual, you're looking at approximately $3,240. This is actually quite different from the federal express entry program, for example. That's a federal program where the funds requirement is closer to $12,000 Canadian. So the requirement is much, much lower for the Atlantic Immigration Pilot Program. For a family of 3, you need to have a minimum of $4,034 Canadian available to you. For a family of 3, $4,959, and for a family of 4, $6,000. And then it goes up, of course, by family unit. So you're looking at, approximately $500 to $600 per individual increase, a little bit more than that. So in terms of the processing time for this application, the processing time altogether, from the date that we submit the designation for the employer all the way through to the day that you become a permanent resident yourself, is approximately 10 months. So I typically will tell clients that it's under a year. So certainly within 12 months, you should have your permanent residency. And this is because it takes time, of course, to get the employer designated, to file the endorsement, and then of course to file the permanent residency application. The permanent residency application, if you file inland, typically they're taking right around 6 months right now. But of course, due to COVID-19, there are delays in every different type of application. So we are being told to expect delays on every, in every capacity, whether you're filing inside or outside. But because of the border closures for the time being, you can expect that the outside Canada applications, for the time being at least, will be delayed and possibly take longer than the 10 months altogether. The other thing I wanted to mention about the AIPP is that where people normally make errors is that it's really important to demonstrate that you have that 1 year work. If you're applying under the intermediate or the high skilled categories, it's really important to demonstrate that you have that 1 year of work experience, either in a NOC C or a NOC A or B position. And so it can often be difficult to do that on your own or without fully understanding, the meaning of the NOC code you've chosen. So for example, when you choose let's say you have a 1 year work experience in a NOC B position, then you will need to provide bank statements, pay stubs, pay slips, tax documentation, and employment contracts for that period of employment. And most importantly, that employer will be required to provide a detailed reference letter indicating, your job duties, your wage, the terms and conditions of your employment. And it's really important that the job duties that they list in this support letter match up with the NOC code that you have indicated in your application, and that it is indeed a high skilled NOC. So it's really important to get advice surrounding that, and that's one of the ways where we come in to help with that. We certainly will, we would never draft entirely an employer letter, but what we would do is we would revise it, review it, and then send it back for signature if we don't think it's sufficient. And so that's something that we certainly can help with and make sure that you provide the appropriate, although of course accurate information as well. So that's one of the tips I want to mention. The other thing is that if you are applying, that no matter whether you're applying inside or outside Canada, it's really important to have that English test done. You have to write the general IELTS test. Okay, whether you're applying under any three of the streams, the IELTS test is incredibly important. You will not be able to submit your endorsement application without these test results. And so one of the things we tell clients to do right away is to make sure that you write your English test as soon as possible, because that will delay the process. The other thing that will often delay the process is the education credential assessment. So as part of the AIPP program, you are required to demonstrate that you have at least a high school diploma. Now, under the international graduate stream, you will not need an ECA because you'll have a Canadian diploma. But under the other two streams, the intermediate stream and also the high skilled stream, then you will be required to demonstrate that you have a minimum high school diploma. And the way to do this, the only way that they will accept an application is if you obtain what's called an education credential assessment, an ECA. And the Canadian government have designated a number of different agencies that they have qualified as being accepted under this program for issuing ECA certificates. And so it's important to have that done as well. So I would say the two things that hold people back the most and that cause delays in applications are the ECA and the language test. And under the AIPP, only the principal applicant will need to obtain this. So you will not need to get this for your spouse if you apply under the AIPP program. But it often will present delays. So it's important that you, even if you don't have a job offer yet, it's important that you get these things done as soon as possible. The language test will be valid for 2 years, and the ECA doesn't have an expiry date, at least not as of now. There are some very clear advantages to the Atlantic Immigration Pilot Program. One of them is the funds requirement. So if you're applying from outside of Canada, the funds requirement is much lower. So as I discussed earlier, the funds requirement for one person is around $3,000 Canadian, as opposed to $12,000 Canadian under the Federal Express Entry Program. So the threshold for funds requirements for settlement funds when you come to Canada is much lower. The other thing that's much lower is the the language test, the requirements. CLB4 is all that's required for the AIPP, no matter what program you apply for, no matter what stream. So remember I discussed 3 streams, and they all require CLB4. It's it's typical in other programs across Canada to require a CLB5 or even a CLB7, depending on the program. So it's clearly lower than in other provinces and under the federal stream. So that's another clear advantage. The other advantage is the timing. So the processing time for the AIPP, the federal portion, is only 6 months. Now, when you add on the endorsement and also the designation, it's closer to 10 months, maybe less, maybe 8 months, depending on the province and how quick, how lucky you are to get someone to process your application quickly. But the processing time is generally much faster than any of the PNPs. Under the PNP programs, you're looking at closer to easily 2 or 3 years. The Federal Express Entry program is really quite good too. It's quick, but it does require a lot more. If you're going to apply under the Federal Express Entry, yes, you can have your PR in about 6 months, but they're going to ask for your, in order to get your point score up, you've got to really have a good point score, first of all, whereas the AIPP doesn't require a point score. It just requires that you meet the criteria. One of the reasons why the program requirements are a little bit less stringent and is for exactly that, is to try to attract people to the Atlantic provinces, because places like Toronto aren't struggling for population growth as much as Atlantic Canada. And so this is one of the incentives that the Atlantic Canadian government has put in place to try to incentivize people to come to Atlantic Canada to hopefully make it their permanent home. Your work experience. So under the Atlantic Immigration Pilot Program, you do not need Atlantic Canadian work experience. You need an Atlantic Canadian job offer, and you need to prove that you have 1 year work experience, but it does not need to be in Canada. You can use foreign work experience for your work experience towards your eligibility for the AIPP. So there's no requirement that you come to Canada and work first and then apply under the AIPP. As long as you have at least 1 year work experience in a NOC A, O, B, or C position, then you can apply under the AIPP without having to come to Canada and working first. I do know that I do work for employers, and I do know that there are employers struggling for workers, but of course it's not in every different industry. Absolutely not. I can tell you that the main areas of shortages are in the healthcare sector, especially in rural areas. So physicians and nurses, audiologists, any type of healthcare professional, especially in a more rural location. The other types of jobs that are in high demand are caregivers. So people taking care of people in old age homes and that kind of thing. So that is another area where there's a huge need for for workers. Construction, truck drivers. These are just the ones that I'm aware of. So that by no means, is an exhaustive list. So there certainly could be others, but these are just some of the ones that I'm aware of. And then also the fast food industry. Now, some of these occupations are low skilled, they're not NOC-C. Some of them are NOC-D. So it really depends on the occupation. But the PNP is a program that's available for individuals who are working in those lower skilled positions. So that's just some of them. The other area, there's one more actually that I'm aware of as well, is the IT industry. So software developers and software engineers. That's another one that's in high demand as well. So if, there's no luck finding a job for this individual, then often coming as a student could be a really, a good alternative, because what it does is they come to Canada as a student to maybe do a post-secondary, like a master's degree or even a PhD. And then upon graduation, they're eligible for an open work permit called a postgraduate work permit. And once you're already in Canada, maybe during school, because while you're in school as a student, you're allowed to work up to 20 hours a week during the semester and full-time during scheduled breaks, as long as you're enrolled in full-time studies the whole time. And so often what people do is they find it's a good way to get their foot in the door by coming as a student first, maybe finding a job, a part-time while a student, and then upon graduation, they either continue to work full-time for that employer, or they're able to, because of boots on the ground, they're in Canada already, they're able to make relationships easier with employers here, and they're able to attend career fairs and go places and find that job easier than they would whether they, had they applied from outside of Canada. And so that's often a really good alternative for people who aren't able to find the job. So that's everything with regard to the Atlantic Immigration Pilot Program. Thank you very much, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon.